It is the most visited national park in America. A place of beauty. A place of peace. Until June 14, 1969. In the span of 60 seconds, during a game of hide-and-seek, 6-year-old Dennis Martin didn't just get lost. He evaporated. A map of Spence Field. A red dot appears where Dennis was, then disappears. 1 minute, he was playing behind a bush. The next, he was gone. The FBI called it a tragic disappearance. But 7 miles away, a terrified family reported something else entirely. They didn't see a boy getting lost. They heard a sickening scream and saw a rough, dark figure carrying something on its shoulder. This is the story of the largest search in national park history, and the deadly mistake that ensured Dennis Martin would never be found. Welcome to Darkness Documented. The disappearance of Dennis Martin. The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of the Great Smoky Mountains, dappling the forest floor with coins of golden light. It was June 14, 1969, and the Martin family had come to celebrate Father's Day in one of America's most beloved national parks. What began as an idyllic family camping trip would end in one of the most extensive search operations in the park's history, and a mystery that remains unsolved more than 5 decades later. Dennis Lloyd Martin was 6 years old, with bright eyes and an adventurous spirit that matched the endless wilderness surrounding him. His family had driven from Knoxville, Tennessee, to spend the weekend at Spence Field, a grassy bald in the Smokies accessible only by hiking. The spot was remote, beautiful, and perfect for a family gathering. Dennis's father, William Martin, his grandfather Clyde, and several other family members had made the trek up the mountain, their camping gear loaded on their backs, their spirits high with the promise of a weekend in nature. The Martin family wasn't alone at Spence Field that weekend. The Russell family, close friends from Knoxville, had joined them, bringing along their own children. The two families had set up camp near the grassy clearing, where the views stretched endlessly across the ridges and valleys of the ancient mountains. For the children, it was paradise, a chance to explore, play, and test the boundaries of the wild in relative safety, always within earshot of the adults. Dennis spent the morning of June 14 playing with his brother Douglas and the other children. They ran through the tall grass, examined strange insects, through pine cones, and reveled in the freedom that the mountains offered. The adults kept a watchful eye, but not an oppressive one. This was 1969, an era when children were given more latitude to roam, when the dangers of the world seemed more distant and manageable. After lunch, the children hatched a plan. Dennis, Douglas, and 2 of the other boys decided they would play a prank on the adults. They would split into 2 groups, circle around through the woods, and jump out to surprise the grown-ups who were relaxing after their meal. It was the kind of harmless mischief that children have engaged in since time immemorial, the kind that would normally result in laughter and perhaps a gentle scolding about wandering too far. The boys separated. Dennis and one of the other children went one way, Douglas and his companion went another. The plan was simple: they would reconvene in a matter of minutes, startle their parents, and bask in the brief chaos they'd created. But Dennis never emerged from the woods. When the other 3 boys came running back into the clearing, laughing and breathless, Dennis was not with them. At first, no one was particularly alarmed. Perhaps he'd gotten turned around. Perhaps he was hiding, extending the game. The adults called his name, their voices carrying across the field and into the tree line. There was no answer. William Martin began walking the perimeter of the clearing, calling for his son. His voice, at first calm and merely searching, began to take on an edge of concern. Other family members joined in, spreading out in different directions. Dennis. Dennis, come out now. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just hours before, now appeared vast and indifferent. By late afternoon, when Dennis had been missing for over an hour, real fear had set in. William Martin made the difficult hike back down to the nearest ranger station to report his son missing. The machinery of a search and rescue operation began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum as the severity of the situation became clear. A 6-year-old boy, wearing only a red t-shirt and green trousers, was alone somewhere in more than 500,000 acres of wilderness, with night approaching. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park is not a gentle place. Despite its name, despite the soft, hazy blue that gives the range its character, the Smokies are ancient, rugged, and unforgiving. The park straddles the border between Tennessee and North Carolina, encompassing deep hollows, steep ridges, and dense vegetation that can swallow a person whole. Black bears roam its forests. Creeks can swell dangerously after rain. The terrain is difficult even for experienced hikers, and at night, temperatures can drop significantly even in June. The first search team arrived at Spence Field as twilight was settling over the mountains. Park rangers, experienced in these situations but always hopeful, began a systematic search of the area where Dennis was last seen. They called his name, listened for responses, looked for any sign of the boy, a scrap of red fabric, a footprint, anything. Other teams were mobilized, their numbers growing through the night. Volunteers from nearby towns, hearing the news over their radios, began making their way to the park. By the morning of June 15th, the search had become massive. What had started with a handful of rangers had swelled to include dozens, then hundreds of people. The National Park Service brought in additional personnel. The Tennessee National Guard was called. Rescue teams from multiple states volunteered their services. Bloodhounds were brought in, their sensitive noses put to work trying to pick up Dennis's scent. The FBI joined the effort, treating the case with the urgency it deserved. William Martin, desperate and exhausted, gave the bloodhounds one of Dennis's shirts to smell. The dogs picked up a trail leading northeast from Spence Field, but after a short distance, they lost it. The handlers tried again, starting from different points, but the results were inconsistent. Some believe the dogs were confused by the number of searchers trampling through the area. Others thought that perhaps the scent had been washed away by a brief rain shower that had passed through. The failure of the bloodhounds to provide clear direction was the first of many frustrations that would plague the search. The operation grew to extraordinary proportions. At its peak, more than 1,400 people were actively searching for Dennis Martin. It was the largest search in the history of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and one of the largest in the history of the National Park Service. The searchers included park rangers, military personnel, FBI agents, local volunteers, expert trackers, and concerned citizens who simply couldn't bear the thought of a child alone in the wilderness. Helicopters swept overhead, their pilots scanning the canopy for any glimpse of red fabric or movement. Fixed-wing aircraft joined the effort, flying grid patterns over the most remote sections of the park. The search was organized with military precision. The area around Spence Field was divided into grids, each assigned to a specific team. Searchers walked shoulder to shoulder through dense underbrush, calling Dennis's name until their voices grew hoarse. They checked caves, hollow logs, creek beds, and cliff sides. Every boulder that a small boy might crawl under was investigated. Every thicket was pushed through, despite the scratching briars and the difficulty of the terrain. As days passed, the mood shifted from hope to grim determination. The weather was not cooperating. Rain came and went, making the search more difficult and raising fears about Dennis's condition if he was still alive. How long could a 6-year-old survive with no food, no water, no shelter? The nights were cold. Dennis had been wearing only a light shirt. Hypothermia was a very real possibility, even in June. Theories began to emerge, as they always do in cases like these. Some believed Dennis had simply gotten lost and disoriented, that he was somewhere in the vast wilderness, perhaps injured, perhaps unconscious, but still within the park's boundaries. This was the theory that kept the searchers going, the hope that drove them to check and recheck areas that had already been searched. Children, when lost, often behave unpredictably. They hide when they hear adults calling, thinking they're in trouble. They move in circles. They seek shelter in places adults might not think to look. Others proposed more troubling explanations. There were whispers of animal attacks. Black bears were common in the Smokies, and while they rarely attacked humans, a small child might appear less threatening than an adult. However, no evidence of such an attack was ever found, no blood, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle. The lack of physical evidence argued against this theory, though it couldn't be entirely ruled out. A more disturbing possibility was foul play. In the days following Dennis's disappearance, several witnesses came forward with strange reports. A family hiking in the area claimed they had seen a scruffy-looking man following their young children before Dennis went missing. The description was vague, but the behavior was unsettling enough that they reported it. Could someone have taken Dennis? Could this have been an abduction rather than a lost child case? The FBI investigated this angle thoroughly, but no solid leads emerged. The remoteness of the location made an abduction seem unlikely. Who would be lurking in such a distant spot, waiting for an opportunity? Yet the possibility couldn't be entirely dismissed. Perhaps the strangest report came from a man named Harold Key, who with his family was walking along a trail near Rowan's Creek on the evening of June 14, several miles from where Dennis disappeared. Key reported seeing a disheveled man carrying something over his shoulder, moving rapidly through the woods. The figure was at a distance, visible only briefly, but Key was certain enough of what he'd seen to report it. Was it Dennis the man was carrying? Key couldn't be sure, but the timing and location made the sighting potentially significant. Searchers intensified their efforts in the area where Key had reported the sighting, but found nothing. Days turned into a week. The massive search continued, but the chances of finding Dennis alive were diminishing with each passing hour. Survival experts calculated that a child of Dennis's age could potentially survive 4 to 5 days without water, perhaps longer if he'd found a stream. But nearly a week had passed. The realistic hope of a rescue was giving way to the grim task of recovery. The searchers were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. Many had been in the field for days with little rest. The terrain was taking its toll: sprained ankles, cuts from briars, dehydration. Yet they pressed on, driven by the thought of William and Della Martin, who remained at the search site, their faces drawn with anguish, refusing to leave while there was any chance their son might be found. On June 21, a full week after Dennis vanished, the weather turned severe. Heavy rain swept through the mountains, making search efforts not only difficult but dangerous. Trails became slick, creeks swelled, and visibility dropped. The National Park Service made the difficult decision to scale back operations. The massive search teams were reduced to smaller, more specialized groups. The hundreds of volunteers were sent home with thanks and heavy hearts. The military personnel were recalled. What remained was a core group of rangers and experienced search and rescue specialists who would continue looking, but with the understanding that they were now looking for a body rather than a living child. The search continued in various forms for weeks, then months. William Martin, unable to accept that his son was simply gone, returned to the mountains again and again. He hired private trackers. He consulted with psychics, though he was a practical man who wouldn't normally put stock in such things. Desperation makes us reach for any possibility, however unlikely. He offered rewards for information. He gave interviews to newspapers and television stations, keeping Dennis's face in the public eye, hoping that someone, somewhere, knew something. Leads continued to trickle in, but none led anywhere. A piece of red fabric was found miles from the search area, but it couldn't be definitively linked to Dennis. A child's footprint was discovered, but it was impossible to determine if it was Dennis's or belonged to one of the other children who'd been in the area. Every potential clue was investigated, but the mountains kept their secret. As the summer wore on and the leaves began to turn in the fall, the official search was finally called off. It was one of the most exhaustive search efforts in American history. More than 1,000 people had participated, covering hundreds of square miles of rugged terrain, spending countless hours and significant resources. And yet, Dennis Martin had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. The theories persisted. Some believed that Dennis had fallen into a crevasse or cave system, hidden from searchers by the dense vegetation and complex topography of the mountains. The Smokies are riddled with caves, some known, others still undiscovered. A small body could lie in such a place for decades, perhaps forever, without being found. This theory offered a kind of closure, the idea that Dennis hadn't suffered, that his death had been quick, that his body was simply in a place where no one had thought to look. The abduction theory also maintained its adherents, kept alive by the strange sightings and the uncomfortable fact that Dennis had vanished so completely and quickly. Proponents pointed to the fact that search dogs had lost his scent, which shouldn't happen unless he'd been carried away or gotten into a vehicle. But how a stranger would have penetrated a family camping trip in such a remote location, taken a child without being seen by other family members just yards away, and escaped through miles of wilderness without leaving a trace seemed almost impossible. Over the years, the case attracted the attention of people interested in unexplained disappearances. It became part of a larger pattern of mysterious vanishings in national parks, cases where people disappeared under strange circumstances, often with trained search and rescue teams unable to find any trace of them. Some pointed to these patterns as evidence of something more unusual, wildlife behavior not fully understood, geographical anomalies, even more fantastical explanations. These theories gained no official traction, but they spoke to the deep human need to find meaning in tragedy, to believe that there's an explanation, even if it's one we can't fully comprehend. The Martin family never gave up entirely. Even as years became decades, Dennis's name was still spoken. His father grew old carrying the weight of that single afternoon when his son vanished. The what-ifs must have been unbearable. What if they hadn't let the children play that game? What if they'd kept Dennis closer? What if they'd noticed sooner that he was missing? These questions have no answers, and yet they echo through the years. In 1985, 16 years after Dennis disappeared, a human skull was found in a park not far from where the search had been concentrated. It was a child's skull. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed that the mystery might be solved, that the family might finally have closure. But forensic analysis determined that the skull was not Dennis's. It was too old, had been there too long. Whose child it had been remained another mystery, another tragedy nested within the vast wilderness of the Smokies. The Great Smoky Mountains continue to draw millions of visitors each year. Families still camp at Spence Field, children still run through the grass, and parents still watch the tree line with perhaps a bit more vigilance than they did before 1969. Dennis Martin's disappearance changed something about how we think about national parks. The wilderness is beautiful, it is valuable, it is worth preserving, but it is also dangerous and indifferent. It doesn't care about our plans, our families, or our grief. The case remains officially unsolved. No body has ever been definitively found. No evidence has emerged to conclusively explain what happened in those few minutes when a 6-year-old boy stepped into the woods and never came back. The National Park Service files on the case are extensive, documenting every day of the search, every lead pursued, every theory investigated. But they offer no conclusion, only questions. In the end, the disappearance of Dennis Martin reminds us of our own vulnerability. We like to believe we can control our environment, that we can protect those we love, that the world is fundamentally orderly and knowable. But sometimes a child vanishes into the trees, and despite our best efforts, despite our technology and our determination and our desperate love, we never find them. The mystery persists, haunting and unresolved, a gap in the narrative where there should be an ending. The mountains keep their secrets, and Dennis Martin remains forever 6 years old, forever stepping into the forest on that Father's Day afternoon, forever just beyond reach. The Jameson Family Disappearance. Part 1, The Last Day. The October sun hung low over the San Bois Mountains of southeastern Oklahoma, casting long shadows through the pine and oak trees that blanketed the rugged terrain. It was October 8, 2009, and Bobby Dale Jameson, his wife Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison were preparing for what should have been a routine day trip. They were heading to the remote community of Red Oak to look at a 40-acre plot of land they were considering purchasing, a piece of property so isolated that it could only be accessed by a series of rough dirt roads winding through the mountains. Bobby, 44, had recently been struggling with chronic back pain from a severe truck accident years earlier. The injury had left him on disability, unable to work the manual labor jobs he'd once relied on. Sherilyn, 40, was a stay-at-home mother who devoted most of her time to caring for Madison, a bright, energetic child who loved playing with their family dog, Maisie, a small white Shih Tzu mix who accompanied the family nearly everywhere they went. The Jamesons lived in Eufaula, Oklahoma, a small town of about 2,800 people situated along the eastern shore of Lake Eufaula. To those who knew them casually, they seemed like an ordinary family navigating the challenges of chronic pain, limited income, and the everyday struggles of raising a child in rural America. But beneath the surface, friends and family members would later reveal, the Jamesons were dealing with tensions that few outsiders understood. That Thursday morning, the family loaded into their white 2009 Dodge pickup truck. Maisie jumped into the cab with them, settling in for what the little dog must have assumed would be another adventure with her beloved family. They headed south and west, driving through the rolling hills and dense forests that characterized this corner of Oklahoma, a region where cell phone service was spotty at best and where some roads didn't appear on maps. They were meeting a local man who had agreed to show them the property. According to later reports, the landowner and his wife did meet with the Jamesons that day. The couple would later describe the encounter as somewhat strange. Bobby and Sherilyn seemed tense, perhaps arguing, and they appeared distracted during the property tour. But the meeting concluded without incident, and the Jamesons were last seen heading back toward their truck, which they'd parked along a remote mountain road. After that moment, Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jameson simply vanished. Part 2, The Discovery. When the Jamesons failed to return home that evening, concern rippled through their family network. Bobby's father, Bob Dean Jameson, expected to hear from his son. Friends expected calls that never came. But in those first hours, worry hadn't yet crystallized into panic. Perhaps they'd decided to stay overnight somewhere. Perhaps the truck had broken down in an area with no cell service. Perhaps they'd simply lost track of time. But as Thursday night became Friday, and Friday became Saturday, the absence became impossible to ignore. The Jamesons had essentially disappeared into the wilderness of the San Bois Mountains, an area covering hundreds of square miles of rough, heavily forested terrain where black bears still roamed and where a person could walk for miles without encountering another human being. On October 9, 2009, the Latimer County Sheriff's Office received a missing persons report. A search operation began immediately, though the vast territory and the lack of specific information about where exactly the Jamesons had gone made the effort extremely challenging. Search and rescue teams combed through the mountains, but the area was simply too large, too wild, and too dense to search comprehensively with the resources available. Then, on October 17th, 9 days after the family disappeared, hunters stumbled upon something that transformed the mystery into something far stranger. Deep in the mountains, several miles from any paved road, they found the Jamesons' white Dodge pickup truck. It was parked on a dirt road, positioned oddly, as if it had been abandoned in haste. When investigators arrived at the scene, what they found defied easy explanation. The truck's doors were unlocked. The keys were still inside, sitting on the driver's seat. Bobby's wallet, containing his driver's license and credit cards, lay in the vehicle. Sherilyn's purse was there too. The family's beloved dog, Maisie, was still inside the truck, alive but severely malnourished, dehydrated, and weak after surviving alone for 9 days. But perhaps most bizarrely, investigators found $32,000 in cash stuffed underneath the driver's seat. The money was in a bank bag, and according to later reports, the bills were neatly organized, 20s, 50s, and hundreds, as if someone had withdrawn the money deliberately and placed it there for safekeeping. The truck showed no signs of a struggle. There was no blood, no evidence of violence, no indication of what might have happened to the family who had simply walked away from their vehicle and vanished into the mountains, leaving behind their dog, their money, their identification, and their means of transportation. The physical evidence inside the truck raised more questions than it answered. There were Bobby's medications for his back pain, left behind despite his chronic need for them. There were some of Madison's belongings, a child who had simply disappeared into the wilderness without her parents apparently taking the time to grab supplies or essentials for her. Investigators established a command post and launched an intensive search of the area surrounding the truck. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras flew over the dense forest canopy. Volunteers from surrounding communities joined law enforcement in combing through the underbrush, calling out the names of Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. But the mountains kept their secrets. No trace of the family was found. Part 3, the security camera footage. As the ground search continued to yield nothing, investigators turned their attention to other evidence. They obtained security camera footage from the Jamisons' home in Eufaula, footage that had been recorded in the days before the family's disappearance. What they saw on those recordings would only deepen the mystery. The footage showed Bobby and Sherilyn making multiple trips back and forth between their home and their pickup truck, loading items for the trip. But their movements were strange, methodical yet oddly purposeless, almost trance-like. They would walk from the house to the truck, moving with a peculiar rigidity, carrying items that couldn't be clearly identified on the grainy footage. Then they'd walk back to the house, only to repeat the process moments later. This went on for hours. Back and forth, in what investigators and family members later described as almost zombie-like behavior. There was no sense of urgency, no normal pre-trip bustling or conversation that you might expect from a family preparing for a day trip. Just these odd, repetitive journeys between house and vehicle. What were they loading? Were they even aware of what they were doing? The footage couldn't answer these questions, but it suggested something was very wrong with the Jamisons even before they left home that morning. Family members who later viewed the footage were disturbed by what they saw. This wasn't the normal behavior of their loved ones, they said. Something was clearly affecting Bobby and Sherilyn's mental state, though what that something might have been remained unclear. Part 4, the theories begin. As days became weeks and weeks became months with no sign of the Jamisons, theories about their fate began to proliferate. Each theory had its proponents, and each seemed to explain some aspects of the case while leaving other elements mysterious. Theory 1, foul play. Given the remote location, the large sum of cash in the truck, and the family's complete disappearance, many investigators initially suspected foul play. The San Bois Mountains region, while sparsely populated, had its share of criminal activity. Methamphetamine production was a known problem in some of the more isolated areas. Drug dealers and users sometimes operated in the backwoods, far from law enforcement oversight. Could the Jamisons have stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see? A drug operation, perhaps, or some other illegal activity? Could they have been killed to ensure their silence? The $32,000 in cash added weight to this theory. Where had that money come from? Bobby was on disability and the family wasn't wealthy by any means. Some speculated they might have been involved in a drug transaction themselves, though family members vehemently denied this possibility. Others suggested the money might have been withdrawn for the land purchase, though $32,000 seemed like an odd amount to carry in cash for a preliminary viewing of property. Then there was the matter of Bobby's father, Bob Dean Jamison. According to some family members, Bobby had been involved in a bitter dispute with his father over a family land sale. Bobby had allegedly told friends he believed his father had put a hit on him, though whether this was paranoia, a figure of speech, or a genuine fear was unclear. Bob Dean Jamison was reportedly a difficult man, but would he really have arranged the murder of his own son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter? Investigators looked into these possibilities but found no concrete evidence. No witnesses came forward reporting seeing the Jamisons with anyone else that day. No crime scene was ever located. The family had simply vanished, and if someone had killed them, that person had left no trace. Theory 2: Exposure and misadventure. Perhaps the explanation was simpler and sadder. The Jamisons had ventured into rough country with inadequate preparation. The October weather in the mountains could be unpredictable, warm during the day but cold at night. If they had left their truck for some reason and become disoriented, they could have died from exposure. But this theory had significant problems. The truck was found with all their supplies still inside. Even if they'd gone for a walk and gotten lost, why wouldn't they have taken water, food, or warm clothing? Why would they have left their cell phones behind? And perhaps most troubling, why would they have left Maisie locked in the truck? Moreover, Bobby was familiar with outdoor spaces, even if the San Bois Mountains specifically weren't his usual territory. Would an adult man with wilderness experience really have led his wife and young daughter into the forest without any supplies or preparation? Theory 3: Murder-suicide or family annihilation. Some investigators quietly considered whether Bobby might have killed Sherilyn and Madison before taking his own life. Cases of family annihilation, while rare, do occur, often when a family patriarch feels overwhelmed by financial pressures, illness, or other stressors. Bobby had been struggling with chronic pain and disability. Some family members later reported that both Bobby and Sherilyn had seemed depressed in the weeks before their disappearance. Could Bobby have decided to end all their lives in a remote location where their bodies might never be found? But again, the evidence didn't quite fit. There was no suicide note. The $32,000 in cash suggested planning for some kind of future transaction, not a family on the verge of self-destruction. And family members, while acknowledging Bobby and Sherilyn had their struggles, insisted neither of them would have harmed Madison under any circumstances. Theory 4: Voluntary disappearance. Could the Jamisons have chosen to vanish? Perhaps they were running from something: debt, legal troubles, or dangerous individuals. The cash in the truck could have been meant for a new life somewhere else. Perhaps they'd staged the scene in the truck to make people think they'd met with foul play when in reality they'd rendezvoused with accomplices who helped them start over somewhere new. But this theory required believing that Bobby and Sherilyn would have abandoned their beloved dog to die slowly of starvation in a locked truck. It required believing they'd give up all their possessions, their identities, their entire previous existence. And it required believing that a 6-year-old child could have been convinced to participate in such an elaborate deception and to never reach out to family members in all the years since. Few who knew the Jamisons found this scenario credible. Theory 5: Spiritual warfare. As investigators dug deeper into the Jamisons' recent history, a more unusual picture began to emerge. In the months before their disappearance, Bobby and Sherilyn had apparently become convinced that their home in Eufaula was haunted by evil spirits. They had requested the help of a local pastor to perform an exorcism on their house. Family members reported that both Bobby and Sherilyn had mentioned seeing spirits and had spoken about spiritual warfare. They discussed buying the remote property in the mountains partly to escape whatever they believed was tormenting them in their current home. Moreover, investigators found a peculiar handwritten note in the truck. The note, written by Sherilyn, contained strange statements about hate and death, though its exact contents and meaning were never fully clarified to the public. Some interpreted it as evidence of deteriorating mental health. Others saw it as connected to the family's spiritual concerns. Could the Jamisons' fate somehow be related to their spiritual beliefs? This wasn't a theory about supernatural forces literally causing their disappearance, but rather about whether those beliefs might have led them to make dangerous decisions or affected their mental state in ways that contributed to whatever happened to them. Part 5: The Waiting Years. As 2009 became 2010, and 2010 became 2011, the Jamison case gradually faded from headlines. The Latimer County Sheriff's Office kept the case open, but with no new leads and no bodies, there was little investigators could do. The family had simply vanished into the wilderness, and the wilderness wasn't giving them back. Family members were left in an agonizing limbo. Bobby's mother, Connie Cocotan, spoke to media outlets about her anguish at not knowing what had happened to her son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter. The not knowing, she said, was almost worse than any concrete answer might have been. Psychics and amateur detectives contacted the sheriff's office with tips and theories. Some claimed to have had visions of where the bodies were located. Others proposed elaborate conspiracy theories. But none of these leads panned out. The mountains had swallowed the Jamisons, and 4 years passed with no answers. Then, in November 2013, everything changed. Part 6: The Remains. On November 16, 2013, hunters discovered skeletal remains in a remote area of the Smokestack Hollow area of Panola Mountain, about 2.7 miles northwest of where the Jamison truck had been found 4 years earlier. The remains were located in a wooded area, lying close together, partially concealed by leaves and forest debris. Law enforcement secured the scene and forensic teams began the painstaking work of excavation and examination. 3 human skeletons were found, lying face down, positioned closely together. They were located in an area so remote that hunters rarely ventured there, which explained why they hadn't been discovered sooner despite extensive searches in the years after the disappearance. DNA testing would take time, but investigators were already fairly certain of what they would find. The location, the number of remains, and the circumstances all pointed to one conclusion: Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison had been found. In July 2014, the Oklahoma Medical Examiner's Office confirmed through DNA analysis that the remains were indeed those of the Jamison family. After nearly 5 years of uncertainty, the family's loved ones finally had a definitive answer to at least one question: Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison were dead. They had died in those mountains, likely not long after they vanished. But how they died remained a mystery. Part 7: The Medical Examiner's Findings. The medical examiner's report, when it was finally released, was simultaneously conclusive and frustratingly incomplete. The cause of death was listed as undetermined. The condition of the remains, which had been exposed to the elements for 4 years, subjected to animal scavenging, and reduced to bone, made it impossible to determine with certainty what had killed the Jamison family. There was no evidence of bullet wounds on the bones, which would have been visible as characteristic fractures or holes. There was no evidence of blunt force trauma sufficient to leave marks on the skeletal remains. Soft tissue injuries, stabbing, strangulation, poisoning, would have left no trace after 4 years of decomposition. The position of the bodies offered few clues. They were found face down, lying close together. Some interpreted this as suggesting they might have been executed, shot while lying down. Others thought it consistent with people who had lain down due to illness or hypothermia and never gotten up. Still others noted that animals could have moved and scattered the remains, meaning their final positions might not reflect how they originally fell. What the remains did tell investigators was that the family had been in that location since shortly after their disappearance. They hadn't been killed elsewhere and dumped there later. They had gone to that spot, either by choice or by force, and they had died there. The discovery location, 2.7 miles from the truck, was significant. That's a considerable distance to travel through rough mountain terrain, especially for a 6-year-old child. If the family had simply gone for a walk and gotten lost, why would they have traveled so far from their vehicle? If they were fleeing someone or something, what were they running from? And perhaps most haunting, the remains were found relatively close together. In cases where people die of exposure after getting lost, bodies are often found scattered, as disoriented individuals wander in different directions or as stronger family members try to go for help while weaker ones stay behind. But the Jamisons had apparently stayed together until the very end. Part 8, Unanswered Questions. The discovery of the remains should have brought closure, but instead it seemed to deepen the mystery. The confirmed death of the family ruled out some theories. They hadn't voluntarily disappeared to start a new life, for instance, but it couldn't definitively prove what had actually happened. The question of the money, the $32,000 in cash, remained unexplained. Where had it come from? Why was it in the truck? Family members eventually revealed that Bobby and Sherilyn had sold a car shortly before the trip and that the money might have been from that sale plus other savings, intended for the land purchase. But why carry it in cash? Why leave it behind in the truck? The question of the phones and supplies. Why would the family leave their cell phones, medications, identification, and supplies in the truck if they were planning to walk any significant distance? If they left the truck voluntarily, what prompted them to do so without grabbing essentials? If they were forced out of the truck by someone with violent intent, why was there no sign of a struggle? The question of Maisie, perhaps most tragically, why did the family leave their dog locked in the truck? The Jamisons clearly loved Maisie, she went everywhere with them. It seems almost inconceivable that they would abandon her to die unless they were in immediate physical danger or unless something had severely impaired their judgment. The question of the distance, how and why did the family end up 2.7 miles from their truck? That's not a casual stroll, especially not through the kind of terrain they would have had to cover. Did they walk there voluntarily, perhaps lured by something or someone? Were they forced to march that distance at gunpoint? Did they flee in panic from some perceived threat? The question of their mental state, the strange security camera footage, the reports of spiritual concerns, the odd note in the truck, all of these suggested something might have been affecting Bobby and Sherilyn's mental state in the days before the disappearance. Were they experiencing some kind of shared psychotic episode? Had they been using drugs that impaired their judgment? Were they suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning vehicle? The medical examiner's office found no evidence of drugs in the remains, but after 4 years of decomposition, such evidence would have been impossible to detect anyway. Part 9, The Prevailing Theories After Discovery. With the recovery of the bodies, the list of viable theories narrowed, but several remained in contention. Murder. Many who follow the case still believe the Jamisons were murdered, likely by someone involved in illegal activities in that area of the mountains. The San Bois region had problems with drug manufacturing and other criminal enterprises. Perhaps the family witnessed something, or perhaps they were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Under this theory, they were marched into the woods and killed, their bodies left where they fell. The killer or killers then returned to the truck and left it as it was found, either in an attempt to make the deaths look like misadventure or simply not caring if the truck was discovered. The fact that the remains showed no obvious signs of violence doesn't rule out murder entirely. They could have been shot in ways that didn't damage bone, through soft tissue only, or they could have been killed by other means that left no skeletal evidence. The positioning of the bodies, close together and face down, could be consistent with execution, though it's far from proof. Mental health crisis. Another school of thought holds that Bobby and Sherilyn experienced some kind of mental health crisis, possibly a shared psychotic episode or severe paranoid delusions. Under this theory, they left the truck believing they were fleeing some threat, perhaps spiritual, perhaps imagined, and walked deep into the mountains with Madison in tow. Eventually, whether through exposure, dehydration, or intentional action, all three died. This theory would explain the strange security footage, the spiritual concerns, the abandonment of supplies and the dog, and the fact that the family stayed together. If Bobby and Sherilyn believed they were protecting Madison from some spiritual threat or danger, they might have made the irrational decision to leave everything behind and venture into the wilderness. The major weakness of this theory is that it requires both parents to have been simultaneously affected by similar delusions, which, while not impossible in cases of folie-à-deux, shared psychotic disorder, is relatively rare. Accidental death. A third possibility is that the family's deaths resulted from a tragic accident or series of accidents. Perhaps they left the truck to look at something, a view, an interesting natural feature, a potential campsite on the land they were considering. Perhaps they planned to be gone only a few minutes. But then something went wrong. Someone was injured in a fall. They became disoriented. Darkness fell faster than expected. They tried to find their way back to the truck but instead walked deeper into the mountains. Under this scenario, the family might have died from exposure, injury, or a combination of both. 6-year-old Madison would have been particularly vulnerable to the cold October nights. If one parent was injured and the other was trying to care for both the injured spouse and the frightened child, the situation could have quickly become dire. This theory struggles to explain why they would have ventured so far from the truck without supplies, but in the context of what was supposed to be a brief exploration, people often make such decisions without thinking through the risks. Part 10: The Aftermath and Legacy. The Jameson case officially remains unsolved. The Latimer County Sheriff's Office has not made any arrests and has not definitively determined how the family died. The case is classified as suspicious deaths under investigation, a category that acknowledges the uncertainty surrounding what happened on that October day in 2009. For the family members left behind, the discovery of the remains brought a bittersweet form of closure. Connie Cocotan, Bobby's mother, finally had something to bury. Funeral services were held, and the Jameson family was laid to rest together. But the not knowing what happened in their final hours remains a source of pain. Madison's death is perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the case. She was just 6 years old, a little girl who should have had her whole life ahead of her. Whatever happened in those mountains, she was an innocent victim of circumstances she couldn't have understood or controlled. The idea that she might have spent her final hours cold, frightened, and confused is almost unbearable to contemplate. The case has attracted significant attention from true crime enthusiasts, podcasters, and documentary filmmakers. It has been featured on numerous television shows and in countless articles and blog posts. The strange elements, the cache, the dog, the security footage, the spiritual concerns, the remote location, make it a compelling mystery that people continue to analyze and debate. But beyond the fascination with the puzzle of what happened, there's a sadder human story here. 3 people lost their lives in those mountains. 3 people who, whatever their struggles and whatever errors in judgment they might have made, deserved better than to die alone in the wilderness and to remain unfound for 4 years. Part 11: Lessons and Reflections. The Jameson family disappearance offers several sobering lessons about the dangers of remote areas and the importance of preparation and communication when venturing into wilderness spaces. First, it highlights how quickly people can vanish in truly remote areas. The San Bois Mountains, while not as famous as some American wilderness regions, are extensive enough and wild enough that a person could easily disappear. Even in the age of cell phones and GPS, there are still places where technology fails us and where the old rules of wilderness survival still apply. Second, the case underscores the importance of leaving detailed information with others about your plans. If the Jamisons had told someone exactly where they were going, exactly which roads they'd be on, and exactly when they expected to return, the search effort could have been more focused and might have found them sooner. Instead, searchers had to cover hundreds of square miles based only on vague information about where the family might have been. Third, the case demonstrates how mental health issues can intersect with physical danger in tragic ways. If Bobby and Sherilyn were experiencing mental health problems in the days before the trip, and the evidence suggests they might have been, those problems could have impaired their judgment and decision-making at critical moments. The stigma around mental health sometimes prevents people from seeking help or from recognizing that their thinking might be disordered, and that can have fatal consequences. Finally, the case reminds us that not all mysteries get solved. We like to think that in the modern world, with all our forensic technology and investigative techniques, we can answer any question and solve any crime. But sometimes the evidence just isn't there. Sometimes people take their secrets to the grave. Sometimes the most honest answer we can give is, we don't know. Conclusion: the mystery endures. More than a decade has passed since Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison drove into the San Bois Mountains on what should have been a routine day trip. Despite extensive investigation, media coverage, and public interest, no one can say with certainty what happened to them in their final hours. Were they murdered by someone who was never caught? Did they experience a mental health crisis that led them to make fatal decisions? Did they encounter some accident or emergency that spiraled out of control? Each theory has its proponents and its problems, and the physical evidence can be interpreted in multiple ways. What we know for certain is this: a family of 3 left their truck in the mountains of Oklahoma. They walked or were taken 2.7 miles from that truck. They died there, together, and their remains weren't found for 4 years. They left behind loved ones who will never have complete answers about what happened. They left behind a mystery that continues to haunt everyone who learns about it. The Jamison family case stands as a reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly people we love can be taken from us, and how even in our mapped and monitored modern world, there are still places where people can vanish as completely as if they'd stepped off the edge of the earth. The San Bois Mountains keep their secrets well, and perhaps they always will. Somewhere in those hills, on a day in October 2009, something terrible happened to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. Whatever that something was, it ended 3 lives and created a mystery that may never be fully solved. Story 3. The Hinterkaifeck Murders. Prologue: The Farmstead. The snow fell softly over the Bavarian countryside in the early spring of 1922, blanketing the fields in a deceptive peace. Hinterkaifeck Farm sat isolated among the gentle hills between Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, a collection of weathered buildings connected by covered walkways, a typical Einadhof, one of those solitary farmsteads scattered across rural Bavaria where families lived and worked in proud isolation from their neighbors. The farm's name itself spoke to its remoteness, Hinter meaning behind, Kaifeck referring to a small nearby hamlet. Behind Kaifeck. Behind everything. At the edge of the world. Andreas Gruber had worked this land for decades, his hands calloused from the plow, his face weathered like the barn wood. At 63, he remained vigorous, a man of few words and stern demeanor. His wife Kazilia, 7 years his senior, moved through the farmhouse with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had known nothing but work her entire life. Together they had built something modest but solid, a legacy they hoped to pass down. Their daughter Victoria Gabriel lived with them, a widow at 45 with 2 children. Her husband Carl had died in the Great War, or so everyone believed, though whispers suggested otherwise, dark rumors that Carl Gabriel might still be alive somewhere, that his death had been convenient fiction. Victoria's older daughter, also named Cazilia but called Silly by the family, was 7 years old. Her younger child, Joseph, was only 2, and here the whispers grew louder still, for Joseph had been born long after Carl Gabriel's reported death, and some said his real father was Andreas Gruber himself, Victoria's own father. But these were only whispers, the kind that drift through small communities like smoke, never quite solidifying into accusation. The family's maid had left 6 months earlier, in late summer of 1921. She claimed the house was haunted, that she heard footsteps in the attic, voices where no voices should be. The Grubers laughed it off as superstition, the nervous imaginings of a young woman unused to the isolation. They'd managed without help through the autumn and winter, but now with spring approaching and the heavy work of planting ahead, they needed another set of hands. Maria Baumgartner arrived on March 31, 1922, her first day of service. She was middle-aged and practical, a woman who needed the work and wouldn't be frightened by old houses and creaking boards. She unpacked her few belongings in the maid's quarters and set about learning the rhythms of the household. She would be dead in less than 24 hours. Part 1, the 6 days before. Andreas Gruber noticed the footprints on March 25. He was walking from the house to the barn when he saw them clearly in the remnants of snow, boot prints leading from the forest edge across the fields toward the farm. He followed them with his eyes, his breath misting in the cold air. The tracks came right up to the property, approaching the house and barn, circling around. But there were no prints leading away. He stood there for a long moment, studying the snow, the dark line of trees, the empty fields. Perhaps someone had come during the night and left by the road, their departing tracks obscured. Perhaps the wind had covered them. He mentioned it to Cazilia that evening, but neither could make sense of it. The next day, he found a newspaper in the house that none of them had purchased. It was lying on a table, folded open to a particular page. When he asked the family about it, everyone denied bringing it in. The paper was from Munich, dated recently. How had it gotten there? On March 28, Andreas heard sounds from the attic. The farmstead at Hinterkaifeck was designed in the old style, with the family's living quarters, the servants' quarters, and the barn all connected under one large roof structure. The attic space ran above everything, a vast dim expanse of rafters and stored goods. Andreas had been in the yard when he heard it, a distinct sound of movement overhead, like someone walking. He grabbed a lantern and climbed up into the darkness, the wooden ladder creaking under his weight. The attic stretched away from him, full of shadows. Old furniture, trunks, tools hanging from nails. He moved through the space slowly, methodically, the lantern casting wild shapes on the walls. Nothing. Yet the sound had been unmistakable. And there was something else, something he couldn't quite name, a sense of presence, of space recently occupied. The air felt disturbed somehow, as if it still held the shape of movement within it. He climbed back down and said nothing to the family. Why worry them? It could have been rats, or the house settling, or imagination. But that night he lay awake, listening. March 29th brought another strangeness. The lock on the tool shed had been broken, forced open. Andreas discovered it in the morning and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He examined the door carefully. Someone had used considerable force, probably during the night. But nothing appeared to be missing. The tools hung in their usual places, the equipment stood undisturbed. Why would someone break in and take nothing? He repaired the lock himself, saying little about it. But he mentioned the accumulating oddities to his neighbor, Jacob Sigel, when they met by chance on the road. The footprints. The newspaper. The attic sounds. The broken lock. Sigel listened with growing concern. "You should inform the police," he said. Andreas shook his head. "And tell them what?" "That I've heard noises. That someone might have walked across my field." He was a practical man, a man who handled his own affairs. The police were for serious matters, not vague suspicions. "At least be careful," Sigel said. On March 30th, the keys to the house went missing. Kazilia searched everywhere, retracing her steps, checking all the usual places. The keys were important. They locked the connecting door between the family's quarters and the barn, the door to the tool shed, the main entrance. Without them, they couldn't properly secure the property. "They'll turn up," Victoria said, but her voice was uncertain. That evening, Andreas heard the sounds from the attic again. This time he didn't investigate. He sat in the main room with his wife and daughter, the two children already asleep, and he listened to the footsteps moving overhead. They all heard it. They looked at each other in the lamplight, and no one spoke. Whatever was up there walked back and forth for perhaps 10 minutes, then fell silent. Andreas rose, his chair scraping against the floor. He went to where he kept his rifle, checked that it was loaded. Then he sat back down and waited, the gun across his knees, waiting for whatever would happen next. Nothing happened. The house settled into its usual night sounds. Eventually they went to bed, but Andreas slept lightly, the rifle within reach. March 31st, the day Maria Baumgartner arrived, dawned clear and cold. The new maid came up the road in mid-morning, carrying her bag, a capable-looking woman in her 40s. Victoria greeted her, showed her to her quarters, explained her duties. If Maria noticed any tension in the household, any unease, she gave no sign. This was work, and she needed it. She spent the day learning the layout of the farm, the family's routines, the location of supplies and tools. She helped prepare dinner, watched as the family gathered to eat, the older Kazilia stern and mostly silent, Andreas preoccupied, Victoria managing the children. Little Silly chattered about school, her lessons, her friends in the nearby village. 2-year-old Joseph banged his spoon and laughed. An ordinary evening in an ordinary farmhouse, or so it must have seemed to Maria Baumgartner. After dinner, as darkness settled over the farm, she went about her final tasks of the day. Perhaps she heard something from the attic. Perhaps she too felt that strange sense of presence. Or perhaps she was simply tired from her journey and her first day of work, thinking only of her bed and the morning to come. We'll never know what Maria Baumgartner thought or felt in those last hours, because she left no testimony, wrote no letters. She simply existed, and then she didn't. Sometime after dark on that Friday night, March 31st, or in the early hours of Saturday morning, April 1st, someone moved through the farm at Hinterkaifeck with methodical, terrible purpose. Part 2, The Discovery. The people of Kaifeck noticed the absence gradually, the way one notices a sound has stopped only after a moment of silence has already passed. The Gruber family typically attended Mass every Sunday at the church in nearby Weidhofen, but on Sunday, April 2nd, they didn't appear. This was unusual but not alarming, perhaps someone was ill, or needed on the farm. Their neighbors were used to the family's self-sufficient ways. Monday came and went. Little Kazilia didn't appear at school in Weidhofen. Her teacher noted the absence but assumed she was sick or needed at home. The farm remained quiet, no smoke from the chimney visible in the distance, no signs of the usual activity. By Tuesday, concern began to crystallize. Several neighbors noticed that the Grubers hadn't been seen for days. The mailman reported that mail was accumulating, uncollected. Most tellingly, the farm's dog was barking continuously, a desperate sound that carried across the fields. On Tuesday afternoon, April 4th, neighbors Jacob and Crescent Sigel decided to walk over to the farm to check on the family. Jacob was the same neighbor Andreas had spoken to about the strange occurrences, and he'd been uneasy ever since that conversation. As they approached Hinterkaifeck, the dog's barking grew more frantic, more anguished. The farmyard was eerily still. Tools lay where they'd been left. The connecting door between the living quarters and the barn stood slightly ajar. Jacob called out, but received no answer. The only sound was the dog, beside itself with distress and what might have been hunger. Jacob pushed the barn door wider and stepped inside. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bodies of 4 members of the Gruber family lay in the barn, stacked awkwardly on top of each other like cordwood. Andreas Gruber. His wife Kazilia. Their daughter Victoria. 7-year-old Silly. Even in death, violence was written clearly on them. Their heads showed massive trauma, crushed and broken. Blood had pooled and dried on the barn floor, soaked into the straw and earth. The smell was overwhelming, death and decay mixing with the usual scents of animals and hay. Jacob stumbled backward, his mind reeling. Cressons was calling his name, asking what was wrong. He turned to her, his face drained of color, and managed to speak, "Get help. Get the police. Now." She ran. Jacob stood in the yard, unable to go back into the barn, unable to leave. Where were the others? Maria Baumgartner, the new maid? And little Joseph, the 2-year-old? He couldn't bring himself to search alone. He waited, minutes stretching into eternity, until Cressons returned with several other neighbors and a member of the local police. Together they searched the farm properly. They found Maria Baumgartner in her room in the servants' quarters. She lay in her bed, and for just a moment they might have thought her asleep, but the massive wound to her head told the truth. She had likely been killed in her sleep, probably on her very first night at the farm. And little Joseph? They found him in his mother's bedroom, in a crib beside Victoria's bed. He too had been struck down, a 2-year-old child murdered with the same brutal efficiency as the adults. 6 people. An entire household, wiped out. The police from Ingolstadt arrived in force. The farmstead at Hinterkaifeck became a scene of intense activity as investigators swarmed over the property, trying to understand not just who had committed this atrocity, but what exactly had happened. Part 3, The Scene. Examining the crime scene, investigators began to piece together a timeline of horror. The initial attack had occurred in the barn, sometime on Friday night, March 31st, or in the early hours of Saturday morning. The killer had apparently lured or followed the family members to the barn one by one, or in pairs, and struck them down with what was determined to be a mattock, a farming tool like a pickaxe, kept in the tool shed. Andreas Gruber appeared to have been the first victim. He had been struck from behind, the blow so powerful it shattered his skull. His wife Kazilia was killed next, also from behind, with similarly devastating force. Victoria showed signs of having survived longer. She had pulled out clumps of her own hair, perhaps in death throes or agony, and the pattern of blood suggested she had been alive for some time after being struck. Little 7-year-old Silly had also suffered terribly, surviving for hours after the attack. Strands of her hair were found clenched in her dead mother's hand. The killer had then stacked the bodies, covering them partially with hay and straw, as if to conceal them. Then he had walked back to the house. In the servants' quarters, Maria Baumgartner lay in her bed, killed with a single blow to the head, probably unaware of what was happening until the final second. She had been at the farm for less than a day. And little Joseph, asleep in his crib, was murdered last. A 2-year-old child, killed for no reason except that he had been there. But the most disturbing details emerged as investigators catalogued the evidence of what happened after the murders. Someone had remained at the farm. The killer had stayed in the house, living among the bodies for days. The evidence was unmistakable. In the kitchen, recently prepared meals sat on the table. The stove had been used. Food from the pantry had been consumed. The cattle in the barn had been fed, their water troughs were full, and someone had milked the cows. Neighbors reported seeing smoke from the chimney on Saturday and Sunday. The killer had made himself at home, calmly going about domestic routines while 6 corpses lay in the barn and the living quarters. He had eaten the Gruber's food, perhaps slept in their beds, tended their animals. For at least 3 days, possibly 4, he had occupied the farm as if it were his own. Then he had simply left, vanishing as completely as he had arrived. Part 4, The Investigation. The murders at Hinterkaifeck shocked Germany. Even in a nation still reeling from the Great War, still struggling with its aftermath of economic chaos and social upheaval, this crime stood out for its brutality and mystery. The newspapers seized upon it, and soon all of Bavaria was following the investigation. The police followed every lead, questioned dozens of suspects, pursued every theory. The investigation grew to involve over 100 officers and thousands of pages of documents. The most obvious suspect was Carl Gabriel, Victoria's supposedly dead husband. The official story was that Carl had died in the Great War, killed in French captivity in 1914. But there had always been rumors. Some said Carl had deserted, changed his identity, was living under an assumed name somewhere. Others claimed Victoria had received letters from him after his supposed death, that she knew he was alive. If Carl Gabriel had returned and discovered that his wife had borne another child, little Joseph, during his absence, and if the rumors about the child's true father were correct, he would have had motive for terrible revenge. Police searched for Carl Gabriel across Germany and France. They investigated every reported sighting, followed up on every rumor. They exhumed bodies in military cemeteries, checking dental records and bone structure. But Carl Gabriel remained a ghost, neither conclusively alive nor definitively dead. Another suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighbor and reportedly the father of little Joseph. Schlittenbauer had been involved with Victoria, possibly both before and after her husband's supposed death. The timing of Joseph's birth pointed to him, and he had acknowledged paternity in some contexts while denying it in others. He had been one of the first to arrive at the farm after the bodies were discovered, and his behavior there had struck some as suspicious. He had seemed to know where to look, had moved through the house with odd familiarity. But Schlittenbauer had an alibi, confirmed by multiple witnesses. He had been in town during the likely time of the murders, seen by many people. Unless he had an accomplice, he couldn't have committed the crimes himself. Still, investigators noted peculiarities in his testimony, inconsistencies in his statements. When confronted, he grew defensive, evasive. But evasiveness is not evidence, and the police couldn't build a case from suspicion alone. They questioned vagrant laborers, itinerant workers who might have passed through the area. They investigated local men with criminal records, anyone known for violence. They looked into family disputes, business dealings, anyone who might have held a grudge against Andreas Gruber. The theory of a robbery gone wrong was considered and dismissed. Nothing of significant value had been taken from the farm. Money was found in the house, jewelry and other valuables remained untouched. If theft had been the motive, the killer had been remarkably uninterested in the fruits of his crime. Some investigators believed the key to the mystery lay in those strange events in the days before the murders, the footprints, the newspaper, the attic sounds, the missing keys. Someone had clearly been watching the farm, perhaps even hiding on the property. The former maid's claims of hearing footsteps in the attic took on new significance. Had someone been living there, concealed in the vast spaces above the living quarters, watching the family's routines, waiting for the right moment? Police searched the attic thoroughly and found evidence that supported this theory, disturbed areas where someone might have lain, signs of prolonged occupation. But who? And why? The most chilling theory was that the killer had been a stranger with no connection to the family at all, someone motivated by madness or reasons beyond understanding. This possibility frightened people most, because it meant anyone could be next, that there was no safety even in isolation, that evil could arrive from nowhere and destroy everything. Part 5, The Autopsies. Seeking any clue that might crack the case, authorities took the extraordinary step of removing the heads of the victims and sending them to Munich for examination. Forensic science was still relatively primitive in 1922, but there were specialists in Munich who investigators hoped might find something useful. The skulls were examined, measured, studied for any detail that might identify the killer, perhaps traces of the weapon used, perhaps something about the angle and force of the blows that would indicate the attacker's height, strength, handedness. The skulls were also sent to clairvoyants, practitioners of various spiritualist and occult methods popular in the period. Desperate for any insight, investigators allowed these practitioners to handle the remains, hoping for psychic impressions or supernatural guidance. Nothing definitive emerged from any of these examinations. The skulls themselves became lost in the decades that followed, misplaced in the chaos of later years, another mystery folded into the larger tragedy. To this day, their location remains unknown. Part 6, Theories and Shadows. As months passed with no arrest, theories multiplied. Some believed Andreas Gruber himself held the secret. He had been known as a difficult man, harsh with his daughter, possibly, according to the darkest whispers, involved in an incestuous relationship with Victoria. Little Joseph's paternity remained uncertain, claimed by Lorenz Schlittenbauer but rumored to involve Andreas. Had someone killed the family in revenge for this moral transgression? Had Carl Gabriel, if alive, returned to punish this perversion? Others focused on the farm's isolation and the family's modest prosperity. In the economic chaos of post-war Germany, desperation drove people to extremes. Could roaming bandits have targeted the farm? But again, nothing was stolen, and the killer's behavior afterward, staying at the farm, maintaining the routine, suggested something other than mere theft. The possibility of a deranged drifter gained traction with some investigators. Germany in 1922 was full of displaced persons, traumatized veterans, people broken by war and hardship. Perhaps someone deeply disturbed had found his way to Hinterkaifeck, acting on compulsions that made sense only to his fractured mind. A few theorists pointed to political motives. The early 1920s in Bavaria were politically turbulent, with extremist groups of various kinds competing violently for influence. Could the Grubers have been caught up in something political, killed by revolutionaries or reactionaries for reasons lost to history? But none of these theories fit all the facts. Each explained some elements while leaving others mysterious. Part 7, The Years After. The case was never solved. Over the following decades, police would occasionally revisit the investigation, particularly when new techniques became available or when someone came forward with information. More than 100 suspects were questioned over the years, each investigated and ultimately cleared or lost to the fog of insufficient evidence. The farm at Hinterkaifeck stood empty for a year after the murders, slowly deteriorating. Locals were reluctant to go near it, speaking of it in whispers, crossing themselves when they passed. Stories circulated of strange lights seen in the windows, of voices heard calling across the fields at night. In 1923, the property was sold and the buildings demolished. The new owner wanted no connection to the tragedy, no reminder of what had happened there. The materials were carted away, the land cleared. A new farm was built on a different part of the property, and life slowly resumed. But the memory persisted. The Hinterkaifeck murders became part of Bavarian folklore, a cautionary tale, a mystery that refused to be forgotten. Books were written, documentaries filmed, true crime enthusiasts and amateur investigators proposing new theories, pointing to overlooked suspects, finding patterns in the evidence that had eluded professionals. In 2007, students at the Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy took on the case as a training exercise, going through all the old evidence with modern forensic understanding. They concluded that over 100 potential suspects had been investigated, but the most likely perpetrator was probably among them. They could not, however, definitively identify which one. Epilogue: Unanswered questions. More than a century has passed since that terrible night at Hinterkaifeck, and we are no closer to knowing the truth. Who killed the Gruber family? Was it someone they knew, someone with a personal motive buried deep in the family's secrets? Was it a stranger, a wanderer whose path intersected with theirs in the worst possible way? Was it Karl Gabriel, returning like a vengeful ghost? Was it Lorenz Schlittenbauer, despite his alibi? Was it someone else entirely, someone whose name never even entered the investigation? Why did the killer stay at the farm for days after the murders? Was he hiding from something? Waiting for something? Or was the act itself the point, and everything that followed just the inevitable aftermath of madness? What were those sounds in the attic in the days before? Was someone watching, planning, or was the family's fear prescient, sensing danger they couldn't name? We'll never know. The people who might have answered these questions are long dead, the victims, the investigators, the suspects, the neighbors who heard whispers and rumors. The physical evidence is lost or degraded beyond usefulness. The farm itself is gone, plowed under, built over, erased from the landscape. All that remains is the story, told and retold, each telling adding new embellishments or stripping away unlikely details, the truth and the legend becoming more entwined with each passing year. On quiet nights in rural Bavaria, in farmhouses sitting isolated among fields and forests, people still tell the story of Hinterkaifeck. They tell it as a ghost story, as a murder mystery, as a reminder that evil can arrive without warning, that isolation offers no protection, that some questions have no answers. And sometimes, late at night, when the house settles and the wind moves through the rafters, they hear sounds from above and remember that more than a century ago, the former maid at Hinterkaifeck heard such sounds too, and told anyone who would listen that the house was haunted. She left to save herself. The family who stayed, and the woman who arrived to replace her, were not so fortunate. The case remains officially open, though no one seriously expects it will ever be solved. The truth died with whoever wielded that mattock on the night of March 31, 1922, and took that secret to a grave we can't locate, leaving behind only questions, theories,